For today's story, we are covering the story of Adnan Syed, who was the subject and focus of the entirety of season 1 of Serial, which at the time was one of the more popular podcasts that had been released. He was the focus of this wrongful conviction series that was done, and it was quite popular. And a couple years later, he has been released from jail as a Maryland judge has vacated his conviction after the prosecutors filed a motion asking for that because the prosecutors said they no longer had confidence in their own conviction. So Adnan Syed is currently free from jail. The prosecutors do have 30 days to decide whether or not to re-prosecute him, but let's cover what's happened so far in the story. Baltimore prosecutors had asked the Maryland magistrate to vacate the judgment in the case of Adnan Syed, whose decade-old murder conviction garnered renewed interest after it was featured in Serial in 2014. It was a very good podcast, incidentally. At least it was very entertaining. The reporters told a story. They told a very good one. I don't know whether or not there's counter stories to be had, but it was a very good podcast. I listened to it at the time. And so fast forward 8 years later, and the case, I think largely because of that podcast, he's now free. So the judge granted the prosecutor's request shortly before 4 o'clock. He had been convicted with a life sentence of killing his ex-girlfriend in 1999. Her brother told the court Monday he was not opposed to the release, but felt betrayed by how the prosecutors were handling it. So the victim's own brother apparently has enough doubts in his mind that he doesn't oppose the release at this point, which gives you a little clue as to how much the prosecutors must have completely fucked this up. In an emotional statement, Lee told the judge he was not opposed to Syed's release because he has faith in criminal justice in the court, but he said the motion to vacate blinded him and left him shocked. Apparently, they only gave him 2 days' notice because of this surprise motion. They only gave him 2 days' notice, and he lives on the opposite coast of the United States. And he wanted to appear in person, but they wouldn't give him time to get there. So he felt a little bit hurt by that, he only got 2 days notice on the whole thing. I'm not against this release. I'm kind of blindsided. I always thought the state was on my side, but out of nowhere, I hear there's a motion to vacate. I thought, honestly, I felt betrayed. I mean, yeah, that's a lot to process in a very short amount of time. Hey, 48 hours from now, we're going to release the person we convicted of murdering your sister. How do you feel about that? That's not great. He said his mother was also struggling with the news. You think? This is not a podcast for me. It's just real life, he said. Never ending. After 20 plus years, I asked Judge you make the right decision. That's all. That's pretty gracious for him, to be honest. Feeling a little bit hurt by the prosecutors who 20 years after the fact, because it's murder in 1999, so 23 years after the fact, are now just getting around to saying, we think we had the wrong guy all this time. Okay. Prosecutors highlighted several key pieces of evidence in their motion, including the possibility of additional suspects, one who had allegedly threatened to kill Lee, and another who's linked to an address where Lee's car was ultimately discovered. They also said that other possible suspects were convicted of crimes. We believe this is consequential information that needs to be reviewed further, the district attorney said. Prosecutors said they continue to plan their new investigation and asked the judge not to dismiss entirely. They also asked for Syed's release on his own recognizance for the time being. So, yeah, he's not, I guess, strictly speaking, completely out the clear because the prosecutors get 30 days to decide whether or not to prosecute him again, and he's basically essentially on self-imposed home confinement while the prosecutors figure it out after 22 years. It's going great. The district attorney's office said that a year-long review uncovered the new evidence, and the state no longer has confidence in the integrity of the conviction. Yeah. The filing in Baltimore City Circuit Court revealed new information regarding 2 other potential suspects and found that DNA testing yielded mostly inconclusive results or no results at all. To be clear, the state is not asserting at this time the defendant is innocent, the motion reads. However, for the reasons set forth below, the state no longer has confidence in the innocence of the conviction. Well, how gracious for them. The report then goes on to note that the Serial podcast raised doubts and became the most downloaded podcast of all time, which I totally believe. It was extremely popular. And the investigations into his claim of innocence led to the hearing, which led to the attorneys challenging the evidence. So, yeah. So that's all the things that are going on. Thus, for the moment, that appears to be the end for Adnan Syed. It's 20 years later. He's been in prison on a life sentence for 20 years on questionable evidence, on questionable grounds, as was raised by the Serial podcast. And the Serial podcast itself happened 8 years ago. So he's almost been in prison as long as the podcast was out as he was before. 8 years and 12 years respectively. And they finally just said, hey, maybe the evidence against him is a little suspect. We're not saying he's innocent, but we're not confident. So they have 30 days to decide whether or not to charge him again, which after a year-long conviction, a year-long investigation, after 20 years, if they're not ready now, I think they're going to let it go. But they're not going to make that formal announcement, I guess, until the last minute. But that's what's going on in Maryland. The podcast... the podcast subject has been released, and at least for a moment, that brings us to the end of this discussion.